Now, I'm sure you've all attended at least one memorable wedding in your life. I want you to think about that wedding for a moment. The bride, I'm sure, was beautiful. The flowers were lovely. The marriage service seemed to go smoothly. The meal was delicious. The speeches were entertaining. The dance was a lot of fun. But if you've ever been part of a wedding party, or you've had the joy of seeing one of your children married, you know how many things can go wrong and actually do go wrong. The bride is late for the marriage service. I mean, really late. Someone forgot the rings. The best man faints. Or there's what happened to me one time that Reverend Tim asked me to officiate at a wedding. If it's any consolation, on my way here they were actually working the power, but who knows what that is. Anyway, I'll tell you the story. So Reverend Tim asks me to take a wedding here at First Church, and everything was going really well until the little ring bearer, who was about 4 years old, got bored. And he looked over here to where the drums were and kind of wandered, and of course nobody was really paying much attention to him until we got repeat after me, and the little boy goes boom, 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 boom. And every time I spoke to the bride or groom, he started to play drums. Well, you know what happens. Grandma goes over to get him off the drums. Now we couldn't hear anything because of the screaming. And I just thought, the noises we're having right now, that really is nothing compared with that experience. Except that, of course, now I can't read my script. But as you all know, there is a reason why we carry cell phones, if they do what they're supposed to do. There we go. Is this spooky? So, apart from what went wrong at that wedding, think of all the other things that can go wrong. You know, the last frantic minutes of decorating, the fights that happen over some really, really silly things, the sudden thought that comes to the bride and groom's parents as they're sitting in the church, oh, I forgot to invite Mum. Now, come to me to a wedding Jesus went to. He went to the wedding with Mary, his mother, and with some of his disciples. It was a very happy occasion, but in the middle of the reception, something went wrong. The wine ran out. Now, you have to understand that was a major disaster at a wedding in Israel, because wine was the staple drink for all occasions. To run out of wine was essentially to insult the guests. The dignity of the bride and groom and their parents were all at stake. And that's when Jesus stepped in and did his first recorded miracle. He solved the problem, as we all know, by changing water into wine. Have you ever wondered how the head waiter, the wedding coordinator, the master of ceremonies, whatever you want to call him, would have told the story? Perhaps it would have been something like this. Did you say that we almost ran out of wine? That's impossible. I personally checked and double-checked the supply of wine just a few hours ago. Yes, I'm sure. I was once the wedding coordinator at a wedding feast where they did run out of wine. I never, ever want to be that embarrassed again. If it hadn't been for Jesus of Nazareth, I would have been fired. My reputation ruined. What did this Jesus do? He turned water into wine. What did it taste like? Like the best vintage wine from the best vineyards of Israel. No, I'm not trying to put one over on you. No, it wasn't a magic trick. Jesus actually changed water outside of Nazareth. In fact, on a clear day, you can see Cana from Nazareth. I'd been hired to look after the wedding feast for this young couple. As you know, weddings are a big thing in our culture. As is our tradition, the bride and groom were married on a Wednesday evening. Following the ceremony, we held a canopy over them for them to walk under, and all the guests escorted them to their new home. Oh yes, we did the traditional thing. We went the long way round, winding through the streets so that all the people of the village could congratulate them as they passed by. Yes, it was quite a traditional Jewish wedding. So the couple didn't go away immediately on a honeymoon, but they spent the week of their wedding at home, keeping open house for the next 7 days. There was lots of feasting and rejoicing. The bride and groom kept on their wedding garments. They wore their bridal crowns on their heads. We treated them like royalty. We were so excited for them, so happy for them. And that's when one of my staff came to me and said, "We're running out of wine. We'll have to ration it." "No, we can't do that," I said. "Remember, hospitality to others is a sacred duty. We'll insult the guests if we don't have any more wine. We have to find a solution." To be honest, I had no idea what we were going to do. I was panicking inside. I'd have to tell the bride's parents, and I wasn't looking forward to that. There's an old saying in Israel, that without wine there is no joy. And I knew that both sets of parents would never live down the shame of insulting their guests in this way. And I knew that I would be blamed for not ordering enough wine. Then I had an idea. I would speak to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Perhaps she'd know how to solve the problem. Perhaps she knew of someone in the village we could buy some wine from. Mary, you see, was also the aunt of the bride. And I'd been told to talk to her if there were any problems. She seemed like a nice person. But I didn't know how she'd react to the news that the wine jugs were almost empty. Anyway, I got up enough courage to tell her, and she just smiled at me. She just smiled at me. And she said, "No problem, I'll deal with it." And then she walked over to her eldest son. Yes, that's the one, Jesus. She took him aside and spoke to him for a moment. I have to be honest, I moved a little bit closer to hear what she was actually saying. "Jesus," she said, "they have no more wine." And Jesus said the strangest thing to her. "Dear woman, why do you involve me? My time is not yet come." Yes, that's what I thought. What a funny way to talk to your mother. But Mary didn't seem insulted. She turned away, she came over to me and she said, "Jesus will deal with the problem his way. So please just do everything he asks you." I saw Jesus motioning to a couple of my staff, and they followed him to the door of the house. And he stopped right beside 6 large water jugs that were standing there. I'm sure you've seen those kind of jugs at our doors in our homes. You know what they're used for. Since our roads are very dusty, or if it's very wet and muddy, the water in them is used to wash the feet of guests when they come to the house. We also use the water for washing our hands between each course of a meal. Since there were so many guests invited to the wedding, I had personally made sure that the water jugs were all full. "Take the jugs outside and fill each of them to the brim," Jesus told my staff. They looked at me for instructions, and I just shrugged my shoulders and said, "Do it." The water jugs, of course, had been used already, so some of them were nearly empty. But I was puzzled by Jesus' action. It was wine we needed, not water. My staff members went out to the well, and about 10 minutes later they reappeared, one of them with a chalice filled with wine. One of my responsibilities as wedding planner was to taste the wine before the guests were given any. So I sipped the wine that was offered to me, and I was delighted. This was the best wine I'd tasted for a long time. "Where did you get this?" I asked excitedly. "Where was it found?" "This is better than anything we served earlier." And in my head I'm thinking, oh, thank God, someone found more wine. I'm sure I'd ordered enough. I'm off the hook. As the bridegroom passed me, I whispered in his ear, "What a great idea, sir, to keep the best wine until last. They don't do that at any other wedding." He looked puzzled, but smiled at me politely. Then some guest got his attention before I could ask him about the wine. I then noticed one of my staff members was just standing there, looking at me. She cleared her throat. "Sir, no one found this wine. This is the wine Jesus made." We took the water jugs outside, as he told us to, and we filled them up with water. He watched as we put them back at the door. And then he told me to draw some water out of the jugs and to give it to you. The moment I sipped from the chalice, again, I almost fell over. I had put water into the jars myself, but wine was coming out. I checked all the jars. They were all full of the finest wine. "Sir," said my servant, "who is this Jesus? Isn't he a carpenter from Nazareth, the son of Mary and Joseph? No one can change water into wine, can they? Only God could do a thing like that." I looked across the room at Jesus. He looked back at me and smiled. I'm sure he could see how relieved I was. Now, the wedding celebration could continue. Ah, you know who Jesus is now, don't you? You remember hearing about him. That's right. He was crucified in Jerusalem just a few weeks ago during the Passover celebrations. I don't know why our religious rulers hated him so much. From what I hear, he taught people to love God. He healed the sick. He helped the poor. He cast demons out of people. One day, I'm told, he even fed 5,000 folk with just a few loaves and fishes. Do you believe that? Yes, I do. If he could change water into wine, I'm sure he can feed 5,000 people with a couple of loaves and fishes. In fact, I just heard the rumor that he's risen from the dead. Oh, I'm skeptical for sure. But then I thought that no one could ever change water into wine. So what do I know? I met some of his disciples at the wedding, and I've seen them from time to time. So I'm thinking about finding Andrew and Peter and asking them about all this resurrection talk. Just the other day, a traveler came through the village. He was the one who told me that Jesus had risen from the dead. In fact, he said he had seen Jesus alive. I was telling him how Jesus changed water into wine. And he told me about the Passover meal that Jesus had celebrated with his disciples just before his death. It seems he took the Passover bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then he took the Passover wine and said, "This wine represents my blood shed for the forgiveness of your sins." I was thinking about that at supper last night when I broke bread and poured wine into my glass. I've done the same thing 1,000 times or more, but this time it was different because this time I thought about Jesus. I thought of that wedding 3 years ago. I thought about all the things I've heard he said. I've thought about all the things I've heard he's done. I thought what it must have been like to have been crucified, to have nails hammered through your flesh, to have blood pour out of your wounds. I don't know what to make of it all. But let me tell you that as I broke bread and drank my wine last night, I thought about him. He felt so close, as though he was alive. Could it be? Could it really be that he is Emmanuel, God with us? Is it possible that he can forgive our sins, that we can become new people just as though we'd been born again? I do know one thing, though. The more I think of Jesus, the more my life changes. It's as though he's taken my ordinary life and made it very special. Yes. That's it. Just like he changed the water into wine, he has changed me. Oh my goodness, look at the time. We've got guests to serve. Oh, you wonder if Jesus is at this wedding? I'm sure he is. I think he's always present with us. There's a real tendency for us to find meaning in even the simplest of stories. So perhaps today we can at least agree on 3 simple points. First, that Jesus wasn't a killjoy. He didn't try to take the fun out of life. He knew what it was to laugh and to celebrate and to enjoy life. That's why he promised to offer us life in all of its fullness. And second, Jesus didn't perform this miracle to impress great crowds or to make a name for himself. He did it just to help some folk out. Notice that he performed this miracle in an ordinary home in a small village surrounded by family and friends. And he did it in a quiet, unassuming way. Isn't it true that our first ministry as Christians is to those around us, our family and our friends? And then from that launching pad, we take every opportunity to serve other people, but without making a big show of it. We just do it because that's what Jesus would want us to do. As James, the brother of Jesus, said in the New Testament, "What good is it for a person to talk religious talk if it doesn't actually help people in need?" And finally, think of all of Jesus' miracles. In all of them, he showed a deep and wonderful compassion for other people. He found great delight in helping others, Whether it was to heal someone of leprosy, to let the little children sit on his knee, to change water into wine, to die on a cross for you and I. And as Christians, we too need to look for opportunities to serve others for no other reason than we have experienced God's love and mercy for us in Jesus Christ.